The smell of damp earth and expensive lilies is supposed to signify the end of a long journey. But as I stood in the shadows, it felt like the cold, biting dawn of a war I never asked to fight. I am Samuel Thorne. I am 79 years old, and for 40 of those years, I was a master mortician. I have spent my life in the company of the silent, preparing thousands of bodies for their final rest. I have dressed them in their best suits, painted life back onto their pale cheeks, and lowered them into the ground with the respect they deserved. I know the weight of a soul, or at least the void it leaves behind. More importantly, I know the weight of a solid mahogany casket when it actually contains a human being. Standing 50 yards away, hidden behind the rough, ancient bark of a century-old oak tree, I watched my own funeral. It was a surreal, sickening theater. The air was thick with the cloying scent of flowers and the hushed, performative whispers of the living. There was my daughter, Eleanor, draped in black lace that probably cost more than my first car. She was dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, putting on a show of grief that would have been moving if I didn't know her heart was as hollow as the box they were about to bury. Beside her stood Julian, her husband, his hand resting on her shoulder. It was a gesture of comfort that felt entirely scripted, a bit of blocking from a bad soap opera. I remember the taste of the betrayal. It was only 3 weeks ago, but it feels like a lifetime in another man's skin. I remember the dinner Eleanor had prepared, a rare occasion where she actually invited me to their table. The wine had tasted faintly of bitter almonds, a sharp metallic tang that I should have recognized, but I trusted the hand that poured it. I felt my limbs turn to lead within minutes. My heart slowed to a sluggish, painful thud, and I watched, paralyzed, as my own daughter looked down at me with a mask of cold, surgical indifference. "It's better this way, Dad," she had whispered, her voice devoid of any tremor. "The house, the insurance, the retirement fund, you're just sitting on it. You're 80 years old, Samuel. You've had your time. We need ours now." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't call out. I felt my consciousness slip away into a dark, suffocating fog.
I woke up days later, not in heaven or hell, but in a secluded, windowless basement of a property I had nearly forgotten I owned, a dilapidated farmhouse on the edge of the county. I was drugged, discarded, and left to rot while they told the world I had passed peacefully in my sleep. They thought I was too frail to move, too broken by their cruelty to fight back. They forgot that I had spent my life around death. I wasn't afraid of the dark, and I knew exactly how to find my way out of a hole. I watched the pallbearers now. They were Eleanor's friends, young men with gym-toned muscles and empty eyes. They carried the casket toward the open grave with a lightness that made my stomach churn. A mahogany casket with a man of my stature inside should weigh nearly 400 pounds. You could see it in the way the handles didn't bite into their palms. They were swinging it like it was filled with nothing but feathers and lies. "Be careful," Eleanor called out, her voice trembling with a fake, high-pitched emotion that grated on my nerves. He was so heavy at the end. The weight of his illness was just too much for his poor heart to take. I almost let out a rasping laugh from behind the tree. She wasn't talking about my physical body. She was talking about the burden of my existence, the weight of a father who refused to die fast enough for her bank account. If you are listening to this and you think your children would never trade your heartbeat for a higher credit limit, look closer at the papers they ask you to sign when you're tired. Look at the way they check their watches when you tell an old story. I wish someone had warned me that the hands you held when they were toddlers, the tiny fingers that once clung to yours for safety, could be the same ones that shove you into a dark basement to steal your life's work. I wish I had known that blood isn't a bond, it's just a liquid, and for some, it's not nearly as valuable as gold. Subscribe to this channel and listen to my story, because the dead don't stay silent when they've been cheated, and a mortician always knows where the bodies are buried. I watched them lower the empty box into the earth. The priest, a man I had never seen before, began to drone on about a man he never knew. He was a quiet man, the priest said, looking down at his prayer book. A man of peace who lived a life of service to this community. May he find the rest he so richly deserves. I wasn't peaceful.
I was a storm gathering strength in the shadows. I felt the grit under my fingernails, the remains of the coal chute I had clawed my way through to escape that basement. My fingers were still raw, the skin torn and caked with dried blood and soot, but I felt more alive in that moment than I had in years. I watched as the first shovel of dirt hit the wood. The sound was a hollow, echoing thud that confirmed everything. There was no body in that box, just air and an empty suit. Julian leaned in toward Eleanor as the mourners began to disperse. I didn't need to be standing next to him to know what he was saying. I have spent decades reading the subtle cues of human behavior in their most vulnerable moments. I saw his lips move, a small, greedy smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's done," he whispered. "The policy pays out on Friday. We can clear the debts by noon." That was the final piece of the puzzle, the life insurance. I had a sizable estate, yes, but the double indemnity policy I had taken out years ago after my wife passed was the real prize. They hadn't just faked my death to get the house. They had committed full-scale insurance fraud. They had forged a death certificate, bribed a doctor, and staged a burial to claim a fortune. I waited. I stayed as still as the monuments around me until the last black car pulled away from the cemetery gates. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of headstones. I retreated deeper into the woods, my mind whirring like a well-oiled machine. I needed a place to hide, a place where I could plan my resurrection. There was only one person in this town who knew me well enough to help, and more importantly, one person Eleanor would never think to check on. I walked for 2 hours, sticking to the back roads and the tree lines, until I reached the edge of town where the industrial district bled into the hills. The neon sign of the Thorne Miller crematorium flickered in the twilight, a buzzing, sickly green light. Miller, my old apprentice, had taken over the business when I retired. He was a good man, a man who understood the sanctity of the work. I pushed open the heavy steel door of the side entrance. The air inside was cool and smelled of ozone and chemicals. I walked through the prep room, my boots silent on the linoleum, and into the small, cramped office at the back. Miller was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, staring at a clipboard.
He looked exhausted. "Miller," I said softly. He jumped so hard the clipboard clattered to the floor. He scrambled back in his chair, his face turning a shade of white I usually only saw on my tables. "Mr. Thorne?" he gasped, his voice cracking. "My God, Samuel? We buried you 2 hours ago. I was at the service. I saw the casket go down." I stepped into the light of the desk lamp. I was covered in dirt, my clothes were torn, and my face was a map of exhaustion and rage, but I stood tall. "You buried a box of air, Miller," I said, my voice firm despite the rasp. "You buried a lie, and now you're going to help me show them what happens when a ghost decides to haunt the living." Miller just stared at me, his mouth hanging open. He looked like he was seeing a specter, and in a way, he was. I walked over to the cold metal table in the center of the room and leaned against it. "I need the logs, Miller," I said. "I need to know who brought me in. I need to know who signed off on the body's arrival at the funeral home." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the door and then back to me. Loyalty and terror were fighting a visible war across his features. "It was Dr. Harris," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. "He brought the paperwork personally. He said you were to be a direct burial, no viewing, because of the contagious nature of the respiratory failure. Your daughter insisted on it, Samuel. She said she couldn't bear to see you like that." I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. Eleanor had covered every base. A contagious illness to prevent anyone from opening the casket. A quick burial to hide the absence of a body. "Then we start with Dr. Harris," I said, my fingers gripping the edge of the metal table until the knuckles turned white. "I want every forged document. I want the logs from the night I supposedly died. I want the truth written in ink that won't wash away." "Samuel," Miller said, stepping toward me, his voice trembling. "They'll kill you if they find out you're alive. They've already gone this far." "They can't kill a man who is already dead, Miller," I replied. I looked out the window at the flickering neon sign. The hunt had begun. I wasn't Samuel Thorne, the victim, anymore. I wasn't the aging father who was just sitting on his fortune. I was the master mortician, and I was about to perform one last, very public surgery on my family's greed.
I was going to peel back the skin of their lies until the rot was exposed for the whole world to see. I reached out and picked up a scalpel from the instrument tray on the table. The steel was cold and bright in the lamplight. I looked at my reflection in the blade, a man who had been discarded but not destroyed. The weight of the world was no longer on my shoulders, it was on theirs. They just didn't know the ground was about to open up beneath them. I felt the silence of the mortuary wrap around me, but it wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. My daughter thought she had buried her past, but she had only planted the seeds of her own destruction. I looked at Miller, who was finally beginning to find his resolve. He picked up his clipboard and nodded. "Where do we begin, Mr. Thorne?" he asked. "We begin with the insurance policy," I said. "We follow the money until it leads us right to their throats." The night was quiet outside, but inside my chest a fire was raging. I had spent my life closing eyes, but now I was going to force them all to look. I was the living ghost, and I was coming home. I put the scalpel back on the tray with a sharp, decisive click. "Friday is the payout," I whispered to the empty room. "By then, they'll wish I had stayed in that basement." The gears of the clock were turning again, and this time I was the one holding the key. Tonight I sleep among the silent, but tomorrow I find my voice. The hunt is on, and I have all the time in the world. They say the dead don't talk, but they've clearly never met a man who spent 40 years as a mortician. I have spent my entire life listening to the stories people leave behind in the lines of their faces and the coldness of their skin. But I never expected my own story to be written in the dirt of an empty grave. I stood in the hallway of the Sterling and Associates law firm, the floor beneath my feet feeling too solid, the air too clean. For 10 days I had lived in the shadows of the Thorne Miller crematorium, breathing in the scent of ozone and formaldehyde while I worked with Miller and a man I'd hired with money Eleanor never knew existed. I had clawed my way out of that basement, out of that cold chute, and I had spent every waking second since then gathering the nails for their coffins. I reached down and adjusted the sleeves of my black suit. It was the finest one I owned, the one I had tailored for the day I would finally be the one on the table. It felt poetic to wear it to my own resurrection. I could hear their voices through the heavy, ornate oak doors. They sounded so composed, so grieving, so utterly victorious. "The paperwork is all in order, Mr. Sterling," I heard Julian say. His voice had that oily, practiced resonance he used when he was trying to sell someone a lie. "We've handled the funeral arrangements as privately as possible, just as Samuel would have wanted." "I understand," Mr. Sterling replied. I heard the rhythmic tap of a pen against a desk. "It's a straightforward payout then, $7 million from the double indemnity policy, plus the full liquidation of the Thorne estate, including the mortuary and the primary residence. Since there was no body for a public viewing due to the nature of the illness, the process was expedited by Dr. Eris's certification." It was so sudden. Eleanor's voice drifted through the wood, sounding thin and fragile. I could picture her dabbing her eyes with that silk handkerchief she'd bought for the occasion. He stopped. 1 minute he was sitting there, and the next, he was gone. We didn't even get to say goodbye properly. "It's a tragedy, Eleanor," Sterling said. There was a pause. "Though I must note, you managed to find the insurance policy and the deed to the farmhouse within an hour of his passing." "Dad was always organized," Julian interjected, his voice hardening just a fraction. "He raised Eleanor to be the same way. He wanted us taken care of. He knew his health was failing, even if he didn't want to admit it to the community. He told us where everything was kept. He wanted the transition to be seamless." I closed my eyes for a second, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door. The memory of that final dinner flashed through my mind, the bitter almond taste of the wine, the way Eleanor had looked at me as I collapsed, her eyes devoid of anything resembling love. I had held her when she was a baby. I had worked 18-hour shifts in the morgue to pay for her private schools and her wedding. I had built a legacy out of the business of death so she could live a life of comfort, and she had repaid me by trying to make that death a reality before my heart had even stopped. I looked at my watch. It was 2 p.m., the exact time they were scheduled to sign the final disbursement. "I believe there is one more beneficiary to be heard from."
I said. I didn't whisper it. I didn't shout it. I spoke it with the same calm, final authority I used when telling a family that their loved one was ready for viewing. I put my hands on the brass handles and pushed the heavy doors open. The sound of the wood hitting the interior walls was like a thunderclap in the silent office. Eleanor's head snapped around. She was sitting in a plush leather chair, her black lace veil pushed back. When she saw me, her face didn't just go pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray, the color of a body that had been on the table for too long. She let out a soft, wheezing gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Julian stood up so abruptly he knocked over his water glass, the liquid spilling across the mahogany desk like an incoming tide. "Eleanor," Julian whispered. Her voice was a thin, terrified reed, trembling with a frequency that made the glass on the desk vibrate. "Mr. Sterling," gasped. He stood up so quickly his chair tumbled backward onto the carpet. "My God, Samuel." "The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," I said. I walked slowly toward the table. I didn't shuffle. I didn't lean on a cane. I walked with the steady, measured stride of a man who owned the floor beneath his feet, a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and decided he wasn't ready to stay. I stopped at the edge of the desk, looking down at my daughter and the man she had chosen to help her kill me. "Though I must say, Eleanor," I continued, my voice cold and smooth as a marble slab, "the funeral was lovely. A bit light on the guest list, perhaps, but the lilies were a nice touch. It's a shame I couldn't be there in person. Oh, wait, I was." "This," Julian roared, finally finding his voice. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging. "This is an imposter. Samuel Thorne is dead. We have the certificate. We saw the casket go down into the ground. This is some kind of sick joke, Sterling." "You saw an empty box go down, Julian," I said. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right in the middle of the insurance papers. "Inside that box was the dignity you thought you could bury," I said. "Inside this envelope is the evidence of your fraud."
You'll find the logs from the crematorium Miller helped me retrieve, the original medical records from my real doctor showing I was perfectly healthy, and the recordings of your little midnight meetings with Dr. Eris in the parking lot of the Lucky Swan." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. "And the best part, Eleanor," I said, leaning over the desk until I was inches from her face. I wanted her to see the clarity in my eyes. I wanted her to see that the fog she had tried to induce with arsenic was gone. "I have the toxicology report Miller helped me secure from my own blood samples, the ones taken right after I crawled out of that basement. Arsenic is a very old-fashioned way to kill someone, my dear." "Dad, wait," Eleanor started. Her voice switched instantly from terror to a desperate, manipulative whimper. She reached out toward my hand, her fingers trembling. "Dad, please, you don't understand. We were in debt. Julian made some bad investments. We were scared of the bank. We did it for your own good, really. We were going to take care of you once the money cleared." "To keep it safe for yourselves," I corrected. I pulled my hand back before she could touch me. "You didn't do this for me. You didn't even have the courage to wait for nature to take its course." "Samuel, I had no idea," Mr. Sterling said, his voice hushed with shock. He was looking at the documents I'd provided, his face etched with a mix of awe and professional horror. "No one did," I said. "That was the point of the contagious respiratory failure lie, wasn't it? No viewing, no autopsy." Julian looked at the door, his eyes darting back and forth. He was a cornered animal, looking for a hole to bolt through. "This won't stand. We'll fight this. You're old, Thorne. You're unstable." "The police will," I said, checking my watch again. "I believe they are currently at Dr. Eris's office. They should be here in approximately 2 minutes to collect the both of you." Julian lunged for the door, his oily confidence replaced by a raw, naked panic. But he didn't even reach the handle. The heavy oak doors swung open again, and 2 uniformed officers I had prearranged were already there.
They stepped into the room, the sunlight reflecting off the silver of their handcuffs. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands.
She began to sob, real tears this time. The jagged, ugly tears of a predator who had finally been caught in her own trap. "I gave you everything, Eleanor," I said. I stood over her, my shadow stretching across her black lace dress. "I spent 40 years among the dead so you would never know want. I built a legacy so you would have a name that meant something in this town. But you weren't satisfied with the legacy," she cried, as one of the officers pulled her up from the chair. "Don't do this! We're family!" "Family doesn't bury an empty box," I said. My voice was cold, final, a heavy lid closing on a coffin. "Family doesn't count the insurance money before the body is even cold." I watched them as they were let out. Julian was shouting, threatening his lawyers, his face a mask of red-veined rage. Eleanor was silent now, her head hanging low, her black veil dragging on the floorboards as she was walked through the lobby she thought she had inherited. The staff of the law firm stood in the hallways, their mouths agape, watching the dead man's daughter being taken away in chains. The silence that followed their departure was heavy, but it was clean. The air in the office no longer smelled like expensive leather and lies. It smelled like the end of a long, painful procedure. Mr. Sterling looked at me, his hand shaking as he stacked the insurance papers. "Samuel, I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've seen greed. I've seen betrayal. But this, call it an exhumation," I said. I walked out of the office. I didn't look at the insurance check on the desk. I didn't care about the $7 million. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The heat of it felt wonderful against my skin. I got into my car, the one Miller had helped me retreat from the garage Eleanor thought was hers, and I drove. I didn't drive to the mortuary. I didn't drive to the house. I drove back to the cemetery. The gates were still open. I walked through the rows of headstones, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I found the mound of fresh dirt. It looked smaller than it had 10 days ago. The lilies Eleanor had left were brown and withered, their petals curling into themselves in the heat. I stood over the headstone. Samuel Thorne, 1946, 2025. A man of peace. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The sun was setting now, casting long, golden shadows over the graves, turning the marble monuments into silhouettes of fire. I felt a sense of closure that no funeral could ever provide. I felt the weight of the last 3 weeks finally lift from my chest. I was alive. My name was restored. The predators were in cages where they belonged. I looked at the headstone one last time. I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man who had finally earned his rest, but not the kind of rest they wanted for me. I reached out and touched the cold, polished marble of the headstone. My fingers traced the letters of my own name. It was a strange feeling, touching your own monument, knowing you cheated the date on the stone. "I'm still here," I whispered to the quiet air. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak tree where I had stood and watched my own end. I turned and walked away, leaving the empty grave behind me. The world was still turning, and for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to be a part of it. I have spent my life preparing people for the end, but I think I'm finally ready to start living for the beginning. I reached my car and looked back at the cemetery one last time. The shadows were deep now, the gold fading into the blue of twilight. I have all the time in the world.